The morning had come, regardless. Cecily Vane had woken at 5, in the narrow bed of the room she had occupied since her father's death, and had lain for a long time listening to the house settle around her. Mrs. Holt had lit the fire before dawn, as she did every morning, without being asked, and the small sound of it had been the only thing in the world that felt kind. By 6, Cecily had risen and dressed by herself, because she could not bear to have anyone's hands on her this morning, and she had stood at the mirror for a long while, looking at the woman the glass returned to her, 24 years old, composed, the pearl at her throat, the last thing her mother had left her, the white flowers in her dark hair not quite straight. She had not fixed them. Aldous Pembridge would not notice. The carriage had come at 8:30, and the county had turned out to watch from behind garden walls and across the green, because in a market town this small there was very little that did not draw an audience. She had kept her eyes forward. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the elms along the churchyard lane had begun to drop their leaves, and the whole of the world seemed to be quietly releasing something it had held too long. She understood the feeling. She understood nothing else this morning. Only that her father was dead, and his debts were not, and that Aldous Pembridge had presented her with the instrument of those debts 3 months ago in the drawing room she had grown up in, with his aunt Lady Sylvia seated beside him like a second judge, and had explained, gently and at length, that there were alternatives to marriage, but that none of them were comfortable. She had not wept in front of him. She had kept her face precisely still, the way she had kept it still at the solicitor's office when the estate accounts were read, and at her father's graveside when the vicar had spoken of God's mercy with the brisk efficiency of a man with several more gravesides to attend. And she had said, "Thank you, Mr. Pembridge. I shall consider what you have said." And she had shown him and his aunt to the door herself. She had wept afterward, into her pillow, alone. And Mrs. Holt had knocked, and Cecily had said she was perfectly well, and Mrs. Holt had said, "Of course you are," in a voice that meant the opposite of the words, and had gone away. 3 months. 30 weeks of the season had passed above Cecily's head, like weather above an underground room, and she had set about managing the estate's remaining effects, and settling what accounts she could, and making herself very quiet and very small inside the machinery that had already decided her fate. She had sorted the papers in her father's desk 3 times, because sorting gave her something to do with her hands that was not despair. She had written letters to his former clients that were correct and measured, and said nothing of her own situation. She had sat across from Aldous Pembridge at 2 dinners that his aunt had arranged, and she had watched him eat his soup and speak to his neighbors about the mill-owner consortium he was advising, and she had thought, with the careful detachment of someone reviewing a contract, this was the man, and this is the arrangement, and these are the terms, and she had told herself that terms were not the same as surrender. They were the same as terms. That was all. She was good at small. She had been good at it her whole life. The county had not noticed her particularly before her father died, and it had noticed her afterward only as a problem to be resolved. To Lady Sylvia's circle, she was the solicitor's girl, a pleasant enough creature, rather educated for her station, not the kind of young woman anyone was fighting over, which was precisely why Aldous had chosen her, though she did not know that yet. She was thinking about this, about the precise degree to which she had been selected rather than courted, when the carriage stopped at the lich gate and she stepped down onto the lane, and a man in worn brown wool said, without raising his voice, "Do not go in yet." She stopped. He was leaning against the churchyard wall, a pace from the gate, in the manner of a workman resting between tasks. His coat was rough, his boots scuffed at the toe, and he held nothing in his hands, which were still at his sides. He was tall, and the stoop of his posture was the kind that comes not from weakness, but from long habit of reducing a large frame in small rooms. She noticed the scar above his left brow, thin as a thread, before she noticed anything else about his face, and then she noticed his eyes, which were dark gray and entirely steady, and which were looking at her as though he had been waiting. "I beg your pardon," she said. The words were automatic, measured, because she had trained herself to measured words. "I am expected inside." "I know," he said. "Miss Vane." The use of her name was strange. Not strange in the way of an insult, and not in the way of a familiar, but in the way of a man who has confirmed something he already knew. She looked at him more carefully, the way she might look at a document with a questionable signature, seeking inconsistency. There was nothing about his dress that belonged to her acquaintance. There was something about the quality of his stillness that did not belong to his dress at all. "I do not know you," she said. "No," he agreed, without embarrassment. "But I know Aldous Pembridge." The name in his mouth had the quality of evidence rather than introduction, and the quality landed on her chest with the small particular weight of something true. She stood there at the lich gate in her ivory gown, with the wind lifting a tendril of hair against her cheek, and she held the phrase inside her mind for a moment, the way she had held that brass button in her glove since her father's funeral, turning it between her fingers without looking. The button was there now, at the heel of her left palm, a small warm pressure against her skin. "A great many people know Mr. Pembridge," she said. "Not the way I know him," the man said. "If you have ever stood at a threshold and felt the air on your skin change before you crossed it, you will understand what happened in Cesily Vane next." She did not move. She said, very precisely, "What is it that you believe you know, sir?" And her voice was level, and her hands were still, but something underneath her ribs had shifted its position and was not yet ready to say why. The church bells began, distantly, their quarter hour. She stepped through the lich gate. He let her go. He did not leave. She had given her coin to the boy near the path, the one in the threadbare jacket who sat with his back against a headstone, and watched the wedding party arrive with the particular patience of the very cold and the very hungry. She had done it quickly, without ceremony, pressing the coin into his closed fist and saying nothing, because there was nothing that needed to be said. And she had thought no one saw because she was not looking for an audience. She did not do small kindnesses for the benefit of an audience. She did them because they were the only small freedoms available to her. And freedom needed no witness to be real. The man in the brown wool had seen. He had seen from 20 feet away, from the shadow beside the far wall, and what had passed across his face in that moment was nothing a person could have described to a third party, because it was too restrained and too specific. It was the look of a man who has found a piece of evidence that confirms a premise he had hoped was wrong about himself. Her name was Cesily, and he had known it for 3 months. And he had not permitted himself to examine the knowledge until now. Edmund Rawlins, the 3rd Earl of Ashvale, had been watching Aldous Pembridge for 4 months before Cesily Vane had entered the picture. The watching had begun, as most things of consequence in Edmund's life began, not by choice, but by circumstance. A morning at the solicitor's office in the city on a matter of his own estate, a conversation overheard through an imperfectly latched door, 2 names spoken by Pembridge to his factor, names Edmund recognized, because they were the names on a promissory note he had held himself. A note which bore a date that preceded by 6 weeks the meeting at which Pembridge claimed the agreement had been made. The note was a forgery. Edmund had recognized this the way a man who has spent 3 years reading everything very carefully, because careful reading was one of the few disciplines that still held meaning for him, recognizes a sentence that does not belong in the paragraph where it sits. He had set a man to watch Pembridge. He had not set a man to watch Cecily Vane. He had done that himself, quietly, twice, from a distance, in a way he had not examined too closely, because examination would have required him to name what he was doing, and he was not yet ready to name it. What he had seen was a young woman of modest means, recently orphaned, conducting herself in a house that was not quite warm enough, with a dignity that was not performing itself for anyone's approval. He had seen her through the library window, reading, in the particular absorbed stillness of someone who reads because the book is more interesting than anything else currently available, not because she wished to be seen reading. He had seen her in the lane, returning from the village, with mud on her boots that she had not noticed, and would not have been embarrassed by if she had. He had not permitted any of this to become a feeling. Walter had been dead for 3 years, and Edmund had learned, in those 3 years, that the machinery of feeling was something he was no longer fully qualified to operate. He had ridden ahead on the wet road because he had been impatient, because he had been 20 years old and always impatient, because no one had ever taught him that speed was a luxury available only to those who could afford the cost of it. Walter had followed, as Walter always followed, and the horse had thrown him on the bend, and Edmund had ridden back to find him in the ditch, and Walter had been conscious for 4 minutes, and then not. He had not said anything in those 4 minutes that Edmund could repeat without his chest closing like a fist. He had simply looked at his brother with the clear, unclouded gaze of a boy of 17 who was still surprised by what had happened. And then the gaze had gone to something else, somewhere Edmund could not follow. He had not galloped since. He had not, for 3 years, been inside a room that required him to look agreeable. He had managed his estate, and read his correspondence, and answered the letters his steward brought him with impeccable and somewhat forbidding efficiency, and he had become, in the county's estimation, the kind of man you discussed at supper rather than invited to it. He was perfectly aware of this. He had cultivated it, which was not the same as being proud of it. He was not proud of it. It was simply the shape of the life that remained, when you removed from it everything that cost more than you could pay. And then there had been Pembridge's forged note, and Pembridge's particular brand of quiet fraud, and a young woman at a library window in the fading light, reading as though the world outside the book was a matter of minor interest. He had worn the workman's coat into the churchyard because arriving as Edmund Rawlins, Earl of Ashvale, would have done one of 2 things: alarmed Pembridge before the evidence could be produced, or been read by Cecily Vane as the intervention of a titled man managing a situation to his own advantage. He did not want her to think that. He was not yet entirely certain it was not true. He had spent the morning sitting with that uncertainty, the way he sat with most things he did not like about himself, at a cautious distance, measuring it. What he was certain of was the forged instrument in his coat pocket, and the letter from Sir Marcus Breville confirming the magistrate's attendance, and the fact that if he did not intervene this morning, Cecily Vane would be married to a fraudster before noon. He followed her through the gate. Inside the nave, the county had arranged itself into pews, with the practiced ease of people who treat public ceremony as a form of social audit. Cecily walked the aisle on Mrs. Holt's arm, and she was aware of the weight of eyes without looking up to meet them. Lady Sylvia sat in the 2nd row in dark violet silk. And as Cecily passed, she heard, clearly, the murmur into the ear of the woman beside her. A great deal of effort. For a solicitor's girl. The words were not intended to reach her. They reached her as clearly as a struck bell. Aldous Pembridge was at the altar, and his smile was the smile of a man who has been waiting for a pleasant commercial transaction to conclude. It was not a bad smile. It was the smile of a man who believed in efficiency and the proper ordering of advantage. His gold watch chain caught the candlelight. He was, she had thought once, reasonably kind, in the way of a man who had no strong opinions about kindness one way or another. She had told herself this. She had told herself this many mornings. The Reverend Mr. Thorncraft opened his prayer book. Cecily's fingers tightened on Mrs. Holt's arm. "Come with me," said a voice at her left elbow. And there was a hand there, light but certain. And she turned, and the man from the lich gate was standing in the side aisle in the same worn coat, and his dark gray eyes were not asking. They were telling. She said nothing. She took one step toward him, because something in her that was older and more honest than her fear had already decided, and the step felt less like compliance and more like the end of a very long-held breath. The Reverend Mr. Thorncraft looked up. Aldous Pembridge said, with the first genuine sharpness she had heard from him, "What is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," the man said, and his voice had changed, had dropped a register, and taken on the quality of a man who has never in his life needed to raise it to be heard, "is that this ceremony will not proceed." Pembridge's face underwent a series of small, rapid adjustments, like a card player who has been shown the bottom of his opponent's hand. "I do not know who you are," he said, "but I will have you removed." "You know very well who I am," the man said, and reached into his coat. "But more to the point, Sir Marcus Breville knows what you are." "Miss Vane is not for you, Pembridge," he said then, and his voice carried through the nave without effort, the way a stone carries through still water. "She never was." 12 words. Cecily counted them later. Not because she needed to, but because the mind does that with sentences that rearrange the furniture of the world. 12 words, level and irrevocable, the kind of sentence that does not invite a response because it is not an invitation. It is a conclusion. Pembridge said, with the last of his composure, "This is outrageous. This is a solicitor's girl, whose father had no more standing than—" And his voice rose past its careful register. For the first time, "Her father's affairs are a matter of public record," the man said. "Yours shortly will be." He was not wearing the brown wool anymore. Cecily realized this without understanding when the change had happened, or how she had failed to notice that beneath the roughened greatcoat, removed now and folded over the pew end, he wore a precisely fitted dark navy tailcoat and a white cravat of the kind that required a man who knew what he was doing to tie. She understood then what the quality of his stillness had been, the stillness she had noticed at the lich gate, and misread as the patience of a working man resting between tasks. It was the stillness of a man who had nowhere to be except precisely where he was. She understood it the way you understand a long-held note when it finally resolves into its chord. The door at the back of the nave opened, and an older man in a magistrate's dark coat entered with 2 other gentlemen, and the county arranged itself very rapidly into a new and different attention. Cecily stepped aside. She did not do it because she was told to. She did it because she had been trained her whole life to read the direction of a room before the room declared itself, and the room was declaring itself now with the absolute clarity of a game being turned face up on the table. For a moment, before the whole of it resolved, she stood very still beside Mrs. Holt, and the older woman took her hand, and the warmth of it was the most real thing in the nave. She could not have said what she felt. Her mind was moving too quickly, assembling fragments into something coherent, and what it was assembling was this. The debt had been false, that she had suspected, once, very briefly, and had dismissed the suspicion because she had no means to pursue it, and no one to pursue it with her. That a man she had never spoken to before this morning had pursued it on her behalf. For 4 months. Without introduction. Without announcement. Without asking for anything. And had come to the church in a workman's coat, so she would not think he was managing her. She pressed the brass button in her glove. Her father had carried it in his waistcoat pocket for 30 years, and had given it to her on his last coherent morning, and she had held it since with the particular tenderness of things that cannot be replaced. It was warm from her palm. It was the small, immovable fact she had carried through every cold room of the last 3 months, and it was there now, and she was still here, and the ceremony had not concluded. Out in the churchyard, the dark moment had come and gone with the particular speed of things you spend months dreading. It had come in the vestibule, in the 5 minutes between Edmund's declaration and Sir Marcus's arrival. She had been standing just outside the nave door, not quite inside and not quite out, with her back to the stone arch and the grey sky above the churchyard and the sound of Pembridge's voice, still controlled, still the voice of a man who believed the situation might yet be recovered, coming through the door behind her. And Miss Dorothea Crane had come around the corner of the porch with Miss Hartwell at her elbow, and had seen Cesily, and had said, not quietly enough, "Whatever happens in there, the solicitor's girl is ruined. No one will take her after this." Cesily had not moved. She had stood very still with her back to the stone arch, and she had held the brass button inside her glove, and she had looked at the headstone nearest the path, which bore the name of one Eliza Moorfield. Died 1789. Beloved. And she had thought of the word, beloved. The word was a fact. It was cut into the stone, and it was a fact. And it would outlast Miss Dorothea Crane's opinion by 200 years at minimum. And that was something. She did not feel strong. She felt the particular clarity of someone who has passed through the worst of it and has not yet caught up to the other side. It was in that moment, with Miss Dorothea Crane's words still in the air, that she almost turned and went back to Pembridge. Not because she wished to marry him, because she believed, for those few very cold minutes, that this was what she deserved. Not Pembridge specifically, but the available options as currently constituted, the world with its hand already dealt, and its mind already made up, and its vocabulary for women of her position already fixed. The solicitor's girl. Past the useful years. A problem to be resolved. She had pressed the button until the edge of it pressed back. Mrs. Holt found her there. She settled onto the bench beside Cesily without announcement, as she had settled into every room of Cecily's life for 30 years, and said nothing, and the nothing was correct. The county guests had retreated to the porch in small, murmuring groups, because the county always found a cluster when the uncommon occurred, for warmth and the comfort of shared interpretation. The man in the navy coat came out and stood a few feet from her, not too close, and said nothing for a moment. "You will want an explanation," he said. "I would like one. Yes," she said. He sat, not beside her, but at the far end of the bench, at the proper distance, and he told her. Pembridge and the forged note, his own estate's connection to the matter, the factor's name, the date discrepancy. He spoke precisely and without unnecessary decoration, and she listened with her hands folded in her lap. And when he was done, she was quiet for a moment. "How long have you known?" she said. "That the note was forged. 4 months. That it was yours." He paused, and something crossed his face that was not comfortable, but was honest. 3 months. She looked at him. "And the coat?" A fraction of a pause. "I did not want you to think I was managing you." She held that for a moment. The yew above them moved in the wind. A leaf came down and landed on the stone between them. "Edmund Rawlins," he said. "The Earl of Ashvale." Not as an announcement, as a correction. settling the record. "Cesily Vane," she said. Which was not necessary, and they both knew it. And they both knew. His eyes were dark gray and steady, and they had the quality she had noticed at the lich gate, the quality of a man who had decided to see something clearly and was not looking for permission. She did not look away. She had spent 3 months making herself very small inside a machinery that was not hers, and the looking away had been part of the smallness, and she was very tired of it. "There is," he said after a moment, "a matter of the water rights that Pembridge had intended to sell. They are still yours. Sir Marcus will confirm it." "I understand," she said. "And the house." A brief pause. "The entail your father held was improperly transferred 3 years ago. I have the original instrument. If you wish, my solicitor can." He stopped, looked at his hands, then back at her. "I am doing it again," he said. "Managing me," she said. "Yes." She said very carefully, "You may continue. I do not mind, in this instance." Something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was the shape a smile might leave behind after the season had worn it thin. She filed it away in the part of her mind that was already beginning to arrange new information around a new premise. They were still sitting on the bench when Mrs. Holt, having returned from some private consultation with the housekeeper's particular network of intelligence, settled herself against the churchyard wall and began rearranging her bonnet with the deliberate calm of a woman who intends to remain where she is until the situation resolves itself entirely. If you have ever been seen by someone whose seeing cost them something, you will understand that what Cesily felt next was not gratitude and not relief and not the particular warmth of being rescued. It was sharper and quieter than any of those things. It was the feeling of a question you had stopped asking being answered anyway, in the exact register you had given up hoping for. The county's verdict, inside the nave, had shifted in the way that all collective judgments shift when new evidence arrives, quickly, completely, and with no acknowledgement that the previous verdict had ever existed. By the time Pembridge had been conducted to Sir Marcus's carriage with the forged document folded in the magistrate's coat pocket and 3 credible witnesses to the exchange, the county had already begun the work of remembering that they had always found Aldous Pembridge a little slippery, a little ambitious, not entirely the thing. Lady Sylvia, in the porch, had said nothing at all for several minutes, which was, for her, an entirely new experience. She was not a woman accustomed to silence, and the silence wore upon her visibly, the way a garment in the wrong size wears upon the body inside it. Miss Dorothea Crane, who had whispered to her companion not 2 hours earlier that it was a pity the solicitor's girl had not made a better match in her first season when it might still have done her some good, found herself in the porch saying something considerably different, in a tone that hoped very much it would reach the right ears. Lady Sylvia had come out of the porch when the thing was done, because remaining inside was no longer a viable position. She had come out, and she had found herself standing 3 feet from Cesily Vane and with nothing useful to say, which was a condition so unfamiliar to her that she stood with her mouth slightly open for a full 3 seconds before the social machinery recovered sufficiently to close it. She had said, in a voice that was mostly steady, "Miss Vane, I was entirely unaware," she began. "I know," Cesily said. She had not said it with contempt. She had not said it with triumph. She had said it with the particular level calm of a woman who has absorbed a great deal and is not going to make it theatrical. Lady Sylvia had looked at her for a moment, and something moved across her face that was not quite shame but was in the same family. And she had nodded and turned away. It was, Cesily thought, the first time the woman had made a gesture that did not require an audience. Edmund heard none of this. He was in the vestry with Sir Marcus and the documents. And then he was back in the churchyard. And then he was standing at the lich gate watching Cesily speak to Mrs. Holt, and thinking about the coin she had pressed into the child's fist, with the matter-of-fact tenderness of someone who was not thinking about who might be watching. He had not thought about Walter on a day like this in 3 years. He thought about Walter now, the clear, untroubled gaze in those 4 minutes, the total absence of accusation in it. He had spent 3 years carrying the accusation Walter had not delivered, had become so practiced at it that the carrying had ceased to feel like grief and had begun to feel like ordinary weather, the kind you no longer mention because it has simply become the air. He thought about the vestry. He thought about her face when he had told her, the careful listening quality of it, the way she had not reached for the consoling phrase that would have made the conversation easier for her and cheaper for him. She had sat with it, and she had said, "He sounds like someone worth following." And that sentence was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in 3 years. Not because it resolved anything, because it was true, and it had been said plainly, and he had not been prepared for the plainness. He thought about the coin she had given the child. He thought about the brass button pressed into the earth beside the bench, which he had picked up without thinking, and which was now in his breast pocket beside the miniature, and which he did not know quite what to do with. He was not sure, standing at the lich gate in the thin autumn sun, that he would carry Walter the same way from this morning forward. He was not ready to examine what that meant. He was no longer, at any rate, at quite the same distance from it. In the vestry, before Sir Marcus had arrived, there had been 10 minutes when it was only the 2 of them, Cesily and Edmund, and the single candle on the table, and he had told her about Walter without quite deciding to. He had been explaining the water rights, and the explanation had circled into the years his father had managed the adjoining estates, and the years before he had inherited. And then she had said, quietly, "You were away from the county for a long time." Not a question, an observation. He had been quiet for a moment. He had taken the small miniature from his breast pocket, the one he carried because it was the only image of Walter that showed him laughing, and he had held it for a moment without showing her. And then he had said, "My brother died 3 years ago?" And he had told her the rest of it, the wet road and the impatience and the 4 minutes, in the same precise tone he used for documents, because the precise tone was the only tone that did not unlock something he was not ready to have unlocked in a vestry on the morning he had just spent. She had not said that it was not his fault. She had not said the things that people said, the careful, useful, untrue things. She had sat with it for a moment and then said, "He sounds like someone worth following." Edmund had looked at her for a long time. "He was," he said. He was not at quite the same distance from it after that. The autumn deepened. September became October, and the lane outside the church went to red and gold, and Cesily Vane remained in her house because there was no longer any reason she could not, and the water rights were restored, and the solicitor's correspondence arrived with the regularity of small, vindicating music. Mrs. Holt baked on Wednesdays, as she always had, and the kitchen was the warmest room in the house, and Cesily sat at her father's desk and worked through his papers with the steady, methodical care of someone who has decided that the past, however painful, is entitled to be sorted correctly. Edmund called, in October, twice, and on the first call he brought his solicitor, which was correct and proper, and on the second call he brought nothing, which was also correct in a different way. He sat in the drawing room in the chair that had always been too small for a man of his frame, and accepted a cup of tea, and told her about his steward's plans for the South Field, and listened to her explain the history of the water rights with an attention that was not performing itself. There was a moment, on the second call, when she reached across the low table for the document she needed to show him, and her hand came close to his on the arm of the chair. Not touching, but close enough that she was aware of the distance in the way you are aware of a note held in a room after the instrument has stopped sounding. He did not move his hand away. She drew hers back with the document, unhurried. She had been looked at. That autumn, by a number of people with a number of motives, by the county with its revised and curious interest, by Sir Marcus's clerk with procedural thoroughness, by the mill owner's solicitor with undisguised calculation. She had become very good at knowing the difference between attention that wanted something from you and attention that was simply paying you the respect of being present without agenda. His was the second kind, and it had the particular quality of the second kind that she had almost stopped expecting to find in anyone. She did not say this to him. She filed it in the place where new premises were arranged, and watched him drink his tea, and noticed that he was beginning, very slightly, not to hold his shoulders quite so high. She did not say this. She filed it in the place where new premises were arranged, he said, on the third visit, in November, standing in the drawing room with his hat in his hands, and the firelight making the scar above his brow stand out in a thin, pale line. I am aware that the circumstances of our acquaintance have been somewhat irregular. Somewhat, she said. I should have introduced myself properly, at the beginning. You were in a workman's coat. Yes. She waited. The fire shifted. Outside, the first cold rain of November came against the window glass, and the room held the sound of it the way a held breath holds its warmth. I would like, he said, to call more regularly. If you are willing. She looked at him for a moment. He was holding his hat at his side, and his posture had the quality of a man who had prepared for a negative answer, and was not going to let it show, but was not going to lie about it either. I am willing, she said. He nodded. A small motion. He put his hat on and said good night, and she walked him to the door. And when she returned to the drawing room, Mrs. Holt was in the kitchen doorway with a particular expression that was not a smile, but contained one. Well, said Mrs. Holt. Do not, said Cecily. I have not said anything, said Mrs. Holt, and returned to the kitchen, and the warmth came back through the door with her. By December, the county had completed its revision, and the version of events that circulated at supper tables and morning calls was a version in which Cecily Vane's good sense had always been apparent to anyone paying attention, and in which the Earl of Ashvale's intervention was the sort of thing you would expect from a man of his quality. Lady Sylvia had relocated to her sister's house in Bath, which was far enough away to be convenient for everyone. The boy from the churchyard had been found a position in the Ashvale kitchen, at Edmund's direction, and was apparently settling in with the thorough and unsentimental adaptability of the very young. The evening Edmund arrived at the house in December with the small box was a quiet one. Cecily was reading when Mrs. Holt admitted him, and she set the book down and stood. And he came in out of the cold with frost on his shoulders and said, before she could offer him a chair, I have something that belongs to you. He opened the box. Inside it, set in a small nest of dark velvet, was the brass button. It was the same button, unmistakably, the slight wear on its face, the wear she had memorized over 3 months of carrying it in her glove. She looked up at him. You dropped it, he said. In the churchyard, when you sat on the bench. I have been waiting for the correct moment to return it. You have been carrying it for 3 months, she said. Yes. She said nothing for a moment. The fire in the grate behind her was warm, and the frost was still on his shoulders, and the room smelled of pine from the garland. Mrs. Holt had put over the mantelpiece because Mrs. Holt had always put a garland over the mantelpiece in December in this house for 30 years, and some things did not require a reason. "Edmund," she said. He had not heard his name in her voice before. Not his given name. Not in that register. He was quiet for a moment, and the quality of the quiet was different from all his other quiets, and she watched the difference move across his face without looking away. "I would like," she said, "to stop waiting." He closed the box very gently and held it out to her, and she took it, and their hands were both on it for a moment. The button inside and the winter outside and the fire warm at her back. And he said, with the brevity of a man who has finally found the sentence that fits the situation, "So would I." They stood there in the small warm drawing room at the edge of something that had already changed, and outside the first snow of December came quietly against the window, and the garland moved in some small current of air, and the button was in her hand, and the hand was in his, and the house held them both without ceremony. Cesily thought, briefly and with the particular quiet joy of a woman who has been very cold for a very long time, of her father's desk, and the papers she had sorted, and the water rights restored, and the lane in September going to red and gold, and the boy at the headstone with the coin in his fist, and the man in the workman's coat who had seen. The fire settled. The snow fell. The button was warm. If this story found you this evening, leave a word in the comments. We will be here.